You're listening to God, Law, and Liberty with David Fowler and Gary Humble. We're putting culture on a collision course with the truth.
Welcome to another episode of God, Law, and Liberty. I'm Gary.
And I'm David.
And, so I don't know that this week really will be any more encouraging than last week, because we're still talking about our depravity, but we're kind of continuing our conversation from last week on, where we find ourselves today in the middle of this chaos and trying to find a pathway out of it, but working to combat this idea that, we're just inherently good people versus our biblical understanding of we're really not, and our sin nature and the evil that resides in every man's heart, and our need for Christ. And
right. And we're going to talk a little bit today about how that worked itself out in our forms of government, and what are the practical implications of those two belief systems, and where they lead. I read a quote. I don't have it in front of me exactly. I know we didn't use it last week. I hope we've not used it before. But there's a wonderful little book by Philip Johnson. He was a law professor at Cal Berkeley. He clerked for Chief Justice Earl Warren in the United States Supreme Court. And he wrote a book called Asking the Right Questions, Truth, Meaning, and Something in the Public Debate was essentially what he wrote. And his point was, and every lawyer knows this, that the key to resolving a legal issue or a policy issue is to make sure, he says, that you ask the right questions in the right order. And he said, if you do that, then the answers will inevitably lead you to the correct result, which may not be the result you first would have anticipated. And he said, the problem is we often assume that we know the answers to questions, and we don't. Or we're mistaken about them. And I may have used that a couple of weeks ago. So, for example, one of the things I've been dealing with a friend of mine and legal organizations today, we want to attack Roe versus Wade, or we want to attack Obergefell, or we want to attack, these transgendered sports things where you got guys that are saying, well, I'm really a girl and now I want to run against the biological females. We don't ever stop to make the court answer the question, what does it mean to be human? What does it mean to be male and female? We may make certain assumptions about that. So, for instance, in the Obergefell case, the majority just assumed that, we're born and we're made homosexual, and that's what we are, and it's unchangeable. And nobody said, but then what does it mean to be male and female? Why is there that difference? Why are we not just all androgynous? Why is there a difference? What's the purpose of the difference? What's the ontological essence of difference there? Is there none? And so we just kind of jump to certain conclusions because we don't ask the right questions in the right order. We don't start in the right place. And so one of the things everybody that listens to us needs to understand is that every solution that you see posited out there in the world today, from tearing up, statues and monuments of various people, to moving from, the feminist movement, the Black Lives Matters, whatever it might be, all worldviews have to do three things. And this is what we are dealing with. We're battling over worldviews, not over tearing down statues. We're tearing down statues. And is there a better way to do it? But why are we fussing over these things? And so ultimately, every worldview has to do three things. It has to have an ultimate belief in something. There must be some ultimate reality. You have to start there. And that's why Kuyper had said, so even in the French Revolution, he said, if you want to exclude your conception of God from everything, well, that's certainly a view about God. You can't escape God. He does not allow us to escape having to deal with him. The second thing is you have to explain why things aren't right. We all know things aren't really right. I mean, that's the CNN thing. See, we know things aren't right, so what's the problem? They start out by saying, well, the problem is we're good.
Yeah, they said we're hardwired for our goodness, and the issue with us being evil was the violent systems outside of us that are causing these cycles in us to be evil. But if those things didn't exist, well, we'd just be good. Yeah,
that's right. And so every worldview has to have a redemption story. It has to have some means of saving what's wrong. So you have to start out with what's our foundational belief? What's ultimate reality? If there is no God, then that means certain things. If there is a God, then that means certain things. If there is a God, then what's the nature of that God? Because that'll have implications for things. You have to start everywhere there. Most people don't start there. They just, like catching the flu, they catch some belief about God that, yeah, there's a God and he loves everybody and it's all great and warm and fuzzy and we're going to sing Kumbaya and blah, blah, blah. Well, let's get this question really right. Is that really true? And how do we deal with it? So then why are things so wrong? And so the feminists say, well, because we're in a paternalistic society. So if we can get rid of sexual distinctions, we can have true liberation. Other people say, well, it's property, it's class divisions, it's whatever it is. And so we all then have a system for solving the problem. And the Christian says none of those things are our problem. Our problem is the ultimate reality is God, and we're isolated from him, and we're out of relationship with him, and we've turned from him, and because we're made in our image, we don't even know who we are anymore. And so we're going to screw everything up.
I wish the church believed that were the case. Seems like the church today has bought in that we're in a bout of systemic racism, and we need some critical race theory and some white
something else. We need everything but Jesus is what we need, And so, if we'll all go work in soup kitchens together and work at the inner city ministries together, we'll understand each other and we'll all be loving.
We'll heal the land.
Yeah, and we'll heal the land. Well, that's unbiblical and naive. And does it help me understand the other person better? Yes. Might I then be nicer? Yes. But that's not our fundamental problem. And so when you ask the right questions in the right order, you insist on getting the answers to each one correct as you go, then you'll come to what would be the right solution. But if you get it wrong in the first question, or don't ask the right first question, you'll come to different places. And so that's what we really are facing here. And there's a brilliant little book. Again, I hate to reference Abraham Kuyper, but the man was so prescient in his understanding of things. And they called a Congress on the Social Question in the late 1800s in the Netherlands for some of the European countries that had been Christian. And he says, we're dealing with a social question. Now, he didn't mean by social question, do we have monuments or not? Do we have public schools or not? All that. He said the social question is whether or not you believe the received structures and strictures are no longer adequate for dealing with the problems of the day. And so you have to have a whole new structure. And as long as you believe if we're just nicer or if we're more religious or whatever else it might be, then you have religious problems. Maybe you have other problems, but you don't have a social question. And America is facing a social question, the exact same as was faced in France in the late 1700s. The structures they had, they say, don't work. So they burned them to the ground. Now, our founders said, well, we have a certain understanding of man. He's corrupt. He's, your favorite word over there is rapacious. We talked about that last time.
Ambitious, vindictive, and rapacious, said Alexander Hamilton.
Yeah, that's right. And so they said, well, we better control this. And so here's how they formed a government, and we'll compare it to other ways we answer these questions. So here's what they said. This is Federalist Paper 51.
Which is Madison, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I would encourage people to get it and read, at least, of course, you can find it online. If you want to just read 51, just Google it and you'll find it. But he's concerned about the gradual concentration of powers within the hands of certain departments or certain people. And so he says, the security against that, and I'm quoting here, consists in giving those who administer each department the necessary constitutional means and personal motives to resist encroachments of the others. Ambition must be made to counteract ambition. Isn't that a great statement? Here's the reality. We're all ambitious. I want all the toys. If you've ever been around kids, you see, I want all the toys. I've seen kids literally in the nursery at church be upset about something. They'll go get a toy out of another kid's hand and take it and just put it down. It's kind of like, I'm unhappy and you should not be happy playing with a toy.
Yeah.
I'm going to take
I just don't want you to have it.
I don't want you to have it because I'm not happy. Okay, you're being too happy. So it's kind of interesting, isn't it, that we say men are ambitious, rapacious, and we better use that to our advantage.
Since we know that's the case, let's figure out how to harness it and use it. Yeah.
Yeah, that's right. So
absolutely.
So he goes on and he makes this wonderful statement. It may be a reflection on human nature that such devices as these checks and balances should be necessary to control the abuses of government. But what is government itself but the greatest of all reflections on human nature? If men were angels, no government would be necessary. Well, there you are. Defund the police. We're all angels.
Yeah, we just need grief counselors and social workers.
If we just have the right psychologists to get our minds adjusted, right, we'll all be happy and good. And then he says, but if angels were to govern men, then we wouldn't need external nor internal controls. They wouldn't be necessary. So the question, he says, is how do you enable the government to control the governed, and how do you oblige it to control itself? But see, they had this understanding of man that we're rapacious and greedy and whatever else it was you said. You've got those words down. And they said, but let's use that to our advantage. Because here's what's going to happen. The president is going to want to start usurping authority over the legislative branch by executive orders. But because men like the power to make laws, well, we're going to give them a check, and they can veto the president. They can strip his budget if they want to. Then the executive branch can choose to not execute and administer a law because y'all wouldn't listen to me. And so they gave him a veto power. I think I said they gave the legislature a veto power, but in essence they did. They can always pass a law and undo what they did.
Right.
And then you got courts over here, and all they're supposed to do is exercise judgment to resolve disputes between particular people, not make law for the whole people, which they've gone way out of their boundaries.
Way beyond that. Very, very ambitious on the side of the court.
and so we just don't see much of anybody checking them. Now it used to be that
we start exercising that impeachment muscle again.
Well, that
on the
as
judges.
well as when I was in the legislature, we never went anywhere, but we would sort of play with it in the Judiciary Committee of taking away clerks from the judges. Or reducing the number. Of course, the problem is the judge isn't going to say, well, I'm going to work harder because people need justice. They'll just work slower and people will be denied justice.
Right.
But
then they'll blame you for it.
And then they'll blame you for it. But there are checks and balances if we would use them. And we assumed that those holding power to check would use them. Now, I'll tell you what I think has gone wrong here in this system. And the checks and balances, particularly on the judicial branch, were supposed to be the legislative and the executive branches, right? I mean, those are the only two it could be.
Right.
Or the states, right? States could supposedly check the whole federal government.
In terms of the federal courts, yeah.
Well, that's right, and the whole federal government. But what's happened is I'm more interested in staying elected than in preserving my power because I love to just be in power. And so therefore, I can wipe my hands of difficult decisions and say, well, the courts made me do it. And Lincoln talked about that. There's been some talk of Lincoln's first inaugural speech after the Supreme Court just doused all of us last week, with Lincoln saying, we can't resign our hands into this our government into the hands of this eminent tribunal here.
Yeah.
And he said, but don't blame them. And that's what's interesting. He says, don't blame them. He said the politicians will use them to their own advantage. So in 1860, whatever it was, his first inaugural address, 1860, whatever it was, he nailed it. They're going to overreach their bounds, and politicians will use that to their advantage. And so last night, I was reading a case from the United States Supreme Court in connection with, and I don't sit around at night every night reading Supreme Court cases, but I happen to be.
I think you do actually.
I was looking for one, and the court hit it on the head. They said that people like leaving it up to us to do things, and the people who win by virtue of that, think Roe versus Wade. They always want to rely on precedent. They're not interested in whether it was right or not. As we said last week, the search for truth, the love for truth, that's what the courts are supposed to be at. What's the truth here? But no, I'm not interested in whether you got it right. I'm interested in the fact I won. And now I want to use the fact I won as a precedent and throw stare decisis in the face so I can keep doing the wrong.
Mm.
And so really, if we want to cure ourselves, Congress has the power to cure a lot of this, at least the mistakes of government. Congress can cure the decision about DACA. They can cure the decision about Title VII. All they have to do is pass a law.
All they have to do is legislate.
That's right. One like these were constitutional decisions that wrote something into the Constitution, but they're too dysfunctional to pass a law.
So you got one guy issuing executive orders, and then you got the court. Everybody's making laws except for Congress. And they're too dysfunctional to make it and too unwilling to make it, because if I try to fix Title VII, I'm going to have people mad at me. Either way I go, right? Yeah.
So just blame the court. And then you blame the other party because they're the obstructionist. Oh, well, I would change the law, but you know how the Democrats are. Or I'm a Republican. Well, I'd change the law, but you know how the establishment Republicans are.
Right.
Well, the establishment, I'd change the law, but you know how extreme those right-wingers are. Whatever it is, they all got some excuse for why they can't do their job. And someday they'll face God over it, and that will be a day of reckoning that makes Election Day pale in comparison. But that's how our founders took these understandings that were actually accountable to God. And one of my favorite quotes of Thomas Jefferson, who's, the great deist, and no doubt he was very much a deist in many of his statements. But he said, I fear for my nation when I think that God is just. Now, what kind of deist would make that statement? A really true to the core deist. God started the universe, he's letting it wind down, and then it'll be the end. See, he knows God intervenes in history to judge nations. They put it at the end of the Declaration of Independence, with a firm reliance on providence for the rectitude of our intentions. I mean, we could just use some fine deists anymore today. I'd take Benjamin Franklin and Thomas Jefferson over the people we have in most of Congress, because they understood God's going to judge what we do here. And we better act in reliance on his providence for the rectitude of our intentions. That's just a lost thought. Isn't it funny? We cite Jefferson all the time for separation of church and state, and he makes comments like that.
And we negate those great little pieces of wisdom, for sure.
Yeah. Yeah. So you go to the French Revolution, and they want all for one and one for all and liberty and fraternity and so on and so forth. And they wind up all killing each other off, and they've been unstable ever since. I mean, that's just the way it is. And that's what we said last show. When you turn away from God, what was it Van Prinsterer said? I think it was. He said, when you When you do that, you are constantly...
The constant need for revolution.
Perpetual revolution.
Yeah. Condition of permanent revolution. Yeah.
Yeah.
You said.
Yeah. So, we need to appreciate what we're dealing with here.
And lest we, because again, men are sinful and depraved, and that didn't just happen in 2020. It's always been that way. So lest we think today and that we look around us and think that it's never been, this chaotic. I stumbled upon this letter. I love these old documents. A letter from George Washington to John Jay. This was right. So George Washington is after his presidency. He's a private citizen, and John Jay is in the cabinet. Can't remember his position at this time, but 1786 is 1 year before they began writing the Federalist Papers in 87, and so they're still under the Articles of Confederation. There's no U.S. Constitution yet, and he's writing to John Jay because they're still trying to figure out how to form a union, and you've got these 13 states. They're all completely sovereign. They're realizing that the factions that are building between them, well, we can't defend ourselves against a foreign enemy, and they're which is really how the Federalist Papers started, is how to address the issue of coming together to at least defend ourselves against enemies across the sea. And he says this: what astonishing changes a few years are capable of producing. I am told that even respectable characters speak of a monarchical form of government without horror. I mean, these guys just finished a war beating off a king, and people are already talking about wait a minute, monarchy wasn't so bad, wanting a king again. He said, and from thinking proceeds speaking, thence to acting is often but a single step, but how irrevocable and tremendous. Listen to this, what a triumph for the advocates of despotism to find that we are incapable of governing ourselves, and that systems founded on the basis of equal liberty are merely ideal and fallacious. And this is the commanding general of the army who just beat off the British, the guy that's about to become the first president of the United States, and already in the midst of all this chaos, he's already thinking, man, men are so stupid. There's no way this thing's gonna work. Like we literally, I don't know how we're gonna come up with a system to make liberty actually work.
Yeah, it's one of the things that's interesting in all of this, and a few years later you had Jefferson, and one of the things that I pointed out in my book, The Politics of Loving God, is that the Danbury Baptists who wrote him after he got elected were writing in the context of the fact that during the election process, there was talk between the Episcopalians and the Congregationalists on having a federal church and who would get the patronage of the federal government. And as you know, we had state churches at the time. And so the thought had been that because the Constitution speaks to religion and liberty and so on and so forth, it was a positive grant by the government, not an inalienable right, and therefore the government could change that and establish a state church. And that's why they wrote him. They wrote Jefferson. And he said, no, I'm glad, for the whole people wrote this into their key paper here. There's not going to be an establishment of religion in the federal government. But that was the context. So just like, Washington sitting over here saying, here we are a few years later, and we're thinking, well, maybe a king's not so bad. A few years later, well, maybe an established church isn't so bad. It's kind of like, what was all that bloodshed for?
What did we cross a sea and go to war for, since all this really isn't so bad after all?
Yeah, that's right. Now, there's a fascinating thing here, and this is where, I confess I am nowhere near being willing to embrace this happily. But when you believe that God is sovereign, when you believe that he superintends all things, that he works through all things to either bring out of them what he wants, frustrate what he wants, go beyond what it is that people do. It doesn't mean man doesn't have a free will, but God superintends that free will, like you do with your kids. You let them play so much in the kitchen, taking out things in the cabinet, and then eventually, Andrea steps in and says, "No, can't take those out. That's the china. You can't do that," or whatever. But the belief that I live before the face of God, and that all that I have comes from God, and that God has placed me where he has placed me for his own good purposes, to serve his own good ends, in order that I might be in relationship with him and be in relationship with him for eternity. You have a statement like this that comes from John Newton. Now, John Newton, as people would probably know, was a slave trader. He became a Christian and got out of the business, and he worked with Wilberforce, was an advisor, encourager to Wilberforce to abolish the slave trade. Now, here's what he wrote.
All I know is wherever he's got a statue, we're taking it down.
We're taking it down. But here's what he wrote. If two angels were to receive at the same moment a commission from God, one to go down and rule Earth's grandest empire, the other to go and sweep the streets of its meanest village, it would be a matter of entire indifference to each which service fell to his lot, the post of ruler or the post of scavenger. For the joy of the angels lies only in obedience to God's will, and with equal joy they would lift a Lazarus in his rags to Abraham's bosom, or be a chariot of fire to carry Elijah home. And so I think you and I maybe talked about this.
I'm good with being at the top or the bottom. Doesn't matter to me.
It doesn't really matter, because I live before the face of God. There is a liberty there that the world does not know.
Yeah.
And it, it's not to say I won't go live under a bridge someday. I'll be grateful if I can do that. But if God knows that by living under a bridge, I will be more closely transformed into the image that I was designed to have of God, and be fit and ready to be in God's presence and enjoy his glory forever, and have a glory I can't even imagine, then who am I to tell God that's not the way to do it?
Right. How would you know?
Yeah, how would I know? And so, one of the fascinating stories, I'm looking to see if a preacher will preach a series or a sermon even on Philemon. And I think you and I talked about that. But, it's rarely ever looked at. It's short. I guess why have a series on something that's one chapter, right?
One chapter.
Yeah. But for those who are not familiar with the story, Philemon owned a doulos, a slave, a servant, and there could be any number of ways in which that was expressed. So we ought not just think in terms of, slavery of African Americans or Africans in the Civil War period, but he was a servant. He stole some stuff apparently from his master and ran off. Now he winds up running into Paul and becomes a Christian. And Paul says, "You need to go back. You've been a great help to me, but you need to go back, because I shouldn't keep you because you're not my doulos. You're his. You need to go back." And so the book of Philemon, or the letter to Philemon, is essentially Paul saying, I would have a right to command you to accept him, but I don't, because I don't want to work against what's really in your heart. But, I'm a slave of Jesus Christ, and so are you. And he's your slave, and now he's useful to you for even more purposes than he was before. And accept him back. And by the way, if you think he owes you something for what he stole, charge it to my account. Now, what a powerful statement is that? And for Onesimus to say, I'm going to trust God enough to go back to the person I ran away from, having stolen from him. Is he really good enough that I can trust myself to him? And the answer is, I'm trusting myself really to God.
Yeah, I was going to say the real question there is God good?
Yes. Can I trust God?
Mm-hmm.
Can I trust God? And
so I have as we close with that, I have actually an off the cuff question for you.
Okay.
Well, it's
hello.
You lost me there. It's just with this thing I talked about with Washington and the chaos that was going on, and then it's this observation that I've had recently. So, I know I don't want to get into the whole mask debate. I know people have their thoughts on this whole COVID-19 we still find ourselves in, and I won't get into that except to say this. One of the struggles that we've seen happen as we've gone through this pandemic are something that has struck me personally, and this is just my perception. What scares me is it seems to me that people are so quick and okay with giving up their liberty. It's almost as if, just tell me what to do. Tell me to wear a mask. Tell me to stay home. Tell me to close my business. Sure, no problem. I'll do it. And that, obviously, there's a bunch of people like me who aren't in that crowd, but there are a massive piece of the general population that that seems to be the default. And when I match that, when I think about that in my observation, and I look at things like this from Washington, where he's saying, we just want a war, and these people already want tyranny again. And then I think about, the Israelites, who they were just setting up tents, and God's feeding them with manna, and they're following a cloud, and their king is the Lord God Almighty. And that's not good enough. What do they want? They want a king. They want to be ruled. Why? Because it's what everyone else has. And when I put all those thoughts together, my question to you is, it seems to me, I would, being a red-blooded American, it always seemed to me that our default was freedom. It just seemed natural that, well, people want freedom, Mm-hmm. But when I read this thing from Washington, and I consider the Israelites, and I look at what's happening around us, it actually seems that our default is despotism. Our left to our own devices, our default is to somehow not want freedom, but to desire to be ruled. What is that? Because it's something that I'm just sort of observing, and I'm formulating, and it's antithetical to what I've always thought before. I've always thought that our default is to want to be free, but it's not.
Yeah. Well, okay. Well, there's a whole show. Actually,
and you have 3 minutes.
I have 3 minutes to do it. There's an article that I've mentioned before by Arthur Leff, and he was a law professor at Yale University. Wrote a law review article in the Duke Law Journal, and he said this, and I think it's great. It's the tension that you mentioned. He said, "This is what we want. We want a complete, transcendent, and immanent set of propositions about right and wrong." Now, here's how he defines it: findable rules that authoritatively and unambiguously direct us how to live righteously, live well. Just give me the rules. Give me the ruler. Give me the benevolent king, dictator person, philosopher king of Plato. I just want to live well. He says, but then we want to believe also that we're wholly free, not only to choose for ourselves what we ought to do, but to decide for ourselves individually and as a species what we ought to be. We want to be perfectly ruled and perfectly free. And that's what we want. I want to be perfectly free, but wait a minute. And he posits this question. He goes through, without naming names, Locke and Hobbes and Descartes and all these people, and he says, so great, we're all little godlets now. And your system works great as long as no godlet runs into another godlet. But what happens when the godlets run into each other?
Well,
and he says,
we'll look around. And that's what happens.
Yeah. And so you're right. There is this tension between liberty and law, which happens to be the name of our show, God, Law, and Liberty. And the only place that those can be reconciled is in God, who knows the limits of our liberty, knows our nature, has made provision for its redemption. And no, it's not in paternalism or maternalism or Karl Marx or any of these other things that are out there. And he has laid down a law for our good by which we are to function according to the instructions. And so the interesting thing is that Leff, being a non-Christian, this is literally the first sentence of his law review article. He says we want transcendent and immanent law. Now, for those who don't know what the words mean, transcendent means something above us, over us, outside of us. So that it's not Gary telling me what to do or 100 Garys telling me what to do. It's somebody that's over us all. Okay, good. Now nobody can fuss. But we also want it to be immanent. We want it to be among us. If it's just too transcendent, like the deist, I can't know anything. And guess, of all the worldviews in the world that posit both transcendence and immanence, God. God is transcendent. His judgments and his law govern the earth, and he became especially immanent among us. God with us, Emmanuel, in Jesus. And the only answer that we've been given, the only answer under the sun that will work, we reject because we suppress the truth in our unrighteousness, which is where we began the episode last week.
You know, that's really helpful. As I think about that, there is this default for a need built in to be lorded over, but without a framework of God, we look to government, we look to things of the world, but in reality, what it is a desire for the lordship of Christ.
Yeah. I mean, think about what God did. God's transcendent. He created Adam. God rules over Adam, and he gives him two simple commands to begin with. You're just now starting to walk. Don't eat. One simple command: don't eat of that tree over there, just because I said so. But he put Adam in charge of everything. So see the hierarchy? That is where man always is. He's always under authority, and he always wants to be in authority because that's the way we were designed. And if we don't get that right, we'll mess it up.
It's good, David. See, I knew you were up for the challenge. It's good.
Yeah. Well, it's been a good show. I've enjoyed it.
Yeah,
Everybody have a great 4th of July here.
That's right.
Yes.
I'm going to be in the Smokies.
Well, that's great. I didn't know you smoked that heavily, but you meant in a town
of Tennessee. Yeah.
Okay. Well, have a great time.
Thanks. Well, hey, thanks again, everyone, for joining us. And as always, we'd love to hear from you. You can email us at info@factn.org. That's info@factn.org. God bless you, and we'll see you next time.
If you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to subscribe. And if you want to help spread the word, please give us a 5-star review and tell your friends to subscribe too. We're available on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and wherever you listen to podcasts. God, Law, and Liberty is a podcast of the Family Action Council of Tennessee. We are a 100% supporter-funded nonprofit advocating for family, life, marriage, and religious liberty. For more information, please visit us at www.facttennessee.org. That's FACTennessee.org. And please follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram @FactTennessee.